Mike Tyson. He had learned to survive by making himself feared. In Brooklyn, that meant moving first, hitting hardest, never letting anyone see weakness. By the time he was 14, that instinct had been refined into something else entirely, something that looked like discipline. He was taken in, trained, shaped. The chaos that had defined his childhood was redirected into a system that gave it purpose. For a few years, his life had structure. Someone watched him, someone corrected him, someone told him no. Then, at 20, he became the youngest heavyweight champion in history, and every boundary that had been holding him together disappeared overnight. Mike Tyson didn't grow up believing money would solve anything. He grew up believing force would. The ring had given him a way to use that force without consequences, where violence was rewarded, not punished. But when success arrived, it didn't just reward the violence. It removed every limit around it. There was no one left who could tell him to stop. No curfew, no supervision, no structure that couldn't be bent or broken by the sheer weight of his fame and earning power. At the time, it didn't seem important. He bought cars, then houses, then more cars. He surrounded himself with people who had no reason to say no to him, because saying yes kept them close to the money. His trainer, the one person who had imposed order, died suddenly in 1985. Cus D'Amato had been more than a coach. He had been the only stable authority figure Tyson had ever known. When he died, the system that had contained Tyson collapsed. What replaced it wasn't guidance. It was accommodation. Everyone around him had a role, and none of those roles involved limitation. The money came in faster than it could be tracked. Tyson earned over $300 million during his career, but the money didn't accumulate. It dissolved. It went to cars he didn't drive, houses he didn't live in, people he didn't know. It went to legal settlements, to entourages, to jewelry and animals and parties that lasted for days. He bought tigers. He bought mansions. He bought loyalty, or what looked like loyalty, from people who had learned that the easiest way to stay in his orbit was to never question him. The spending wasn't recreational, it was structural. It filled the space where discipline used to be. He fought because that's what kept everything moving. The training camps, the publicity, the spectacle. It all required him to show up, to perform, to be Mike Tyson. But outside the ring, there was no performance. There was only impulse. He married impulsively. He divorced impulsively. He bought, spent, raged, and apologized impulsively. Every decision was immediate. Every consequence was delayed. His marriage to Robin Givens in 1988 became a public spectacle. She appeared on national television and described living with him as terrifying. The interview aired while he sat next to her, visibly medicated, barely speaking. The marriage lasted a year. The divorce cost him millions, but the pattern didn't change. The money kept coming in, the spending accelerated. Then the consequences stopped being delayed. He was convicted of rape in 1992 and sentenced to 6 years in prison. He served 3. When he came out, the money was still there, but the dominance wasn't. He fought again, earned again, but the aura had fractured. The invincibility was gone. He was still dangerous, still famous, but something fundamental had shifted. The world had kept moving while he was locked away, and the version of Mike Tyson that had terrified everyone in the late 80s no longer fit the 90s. He bit Evander Holyfield's ear in 1997. Not a piece of it. He bit through it, twice, in front of millions of viewers. The fight was stopped. He was disqualified. His boxing license was revoked. It wasn't strategy. It wasn't even rage in the traditional sense. It was the same impulsivity that had always been there, now without even the pretense of control. The act was so bizarre, so inexplicable, that it became the only thing people remembered about the second half of his career. The real damage came later. He kept fighting past the point where it made sense because fighting was the only thing that brought money in, and money was the only thing that kept the structure from collapsing entirely. But the structure was already gone. By the early 2000s, he was losing fights to opponents he would have destroyed a decade earlier. His body was breaking down. His reflexes were slower. His mind was elsewhere. He fought journeymen. He fought in countries that still wanted the spectacle. even if the substance was gone. He declared bankruptcy in 2003, despite earning more than most people would see in 100 lifetimes. The filing listed over $27 million in debt, lawsuits, back taxes, divorce settlements, money owed to managers, trainers, promoters, people who had been paid once and were now claiming they were owed more. The mansions were foreclosed, the cars were repossessed, the entourage dissolved the moment the money stopped flowing. He was left with a career that had ended, a fortune that had evaporated, and a public identity built entirely around a version of himself that no longer existed. It wasn't that he had spent it all carelessly, though he had. It was that there had never been a mechanism to stop him from spending it all. No one had ever said no. No one had ever built a structure that could survive his impulses. The system had been designed to extract performance and revenue, not to protect the person generating both. What no one noticed then was that the collapse had started the moment success removed every external structure. The money, the fame, the power, it had all arrived at once, and it had arrived to someone whose survival had always depended on external limits. Without them, he didn't build a life. He burned through one. He survived eventually. He rebuilt something smaller, quieter, more deliberate. He spoke about his mistakes. He acknowledged the damage. He found work in smaller films, in commercials, in one-man shows where he talked about the person he used to be. But the gap between what he had and what he lost remained immense. Not because he failed to appreciate it, because nothing had ever prepared him to manage it. And by the time he understood that, there was nothing left to manage. If you enjoy stories like this, you'll find many more here. Subscribe to stay with this kind of storytelling. This is Fallen Fortunes. Britney Spears. She had been performing since she could walk, not as a hobby, as a function. By the time she was 11, she was already working in ways most adults never do. Television appearances, dance routines, auditions, rehearsals that lasted longer than school days. Her childhood wasn't interrupted by fame. It was structured around the preparation for it. When the fame arrived, it didn't feel like a disruption. It felt like confirmation. She became the biggest pop star in the world at 17. The album sold millions. The tours sold out. Her face was everywhere. And the system that had built her, managers, producers, choreographers, publicists, stayed in place. She kept performing. She kept working. She kept delivering exactly what was expected. At the time, no one noticed what was being taken. Britney Spears didn't lose control because she made bad decisions. She lost control because she was never allowed to make decisions at all. From the beginning, the structure around her wasn't designed to support her autonomy. It was designed to maximize her output. Every choice, what she wore, what she said, where she went, who she dated, was managed, mediated, or made for her. The performance was constant. The person underneath it had no room to develop separately. The pressure was invisible at first. She smiled through interviews. She danced through injuries. She maintained the image of someone who was handling it all effortlessly. But the image required her to suppress everything that didn't fit. Anger, exhaustion, confusion, doubt. The public saw control. Internally, there was no space left for it. She released album after album. Each tour was bigger than the last. She dated publicly, broke up publicly, reconciled publicly. Every aspect of her life was documented, analyzed, and monetized. The machinery around her required constant content. She provided it, but the cost of providing it was never calculated. She married impulsively in 2004, twice. The first marriage, to a childhood friend in Las Vegas, lasted 55 hours before it was annulled. The annulment paperwork cited lack of understanding, suggesting she hadn't known what she was doing. The second marriage, to Kevin Federline, produced 2 children within 2 years, all while her career continued without pause. The media framed it as dysfunction, but it wasn't randomness. It was someone trying to claim something personal in a life where nothing had ever been hers. Then the scrutiny intensified. The paparazzi followed her everywhere, not occasionally, constantly. They filmed her in parking lots, at gas stations outside her home. They filmed her crying. They filmed her with her children. They filmed her buying coffee, pumping gas, walking to her car. They created a market for images of her distress, and that market was insatiable. The public consumed it. The tabloids profited from it, and she had no mechanism to make it stop. Her divorce was finalized in 2007. The custody battle became public. Federline's legal team argued she was an unfit mother. The tabloids printed every court filing. Photographers camped outside her house. She drove with her son on her lap, a single moment, photographed and turned into evidence of instability. She checked into rehab, then checked out the next day. She shaved her head in a salon while cameras gathered outside. This was only the beginning. The head shaving was described as a breakdown. Narratively, it was framed as the moment she lost her mind. But it was also the first decision she had made in years that no one had approved in advance. She walked into a salon and shaved her own head while photographers documented it through the windows. It was impulsive, destructive, and public. It was also hers. She was hospitalized twice in early 2008, both times involuntarily. Photographers followed the ambulance. The footage aired on television. What should have been private became another piece of content. Her father petitioned for conservatorship, a legal arrangement typically reserved for people who are incapacitated or elderly. The court granted it. At 26, Britney Spears lost legal control over her own finances, medical decisions, career, and personal life. The conservatorship was supposed to be temporary. It lasted 13 years. During that time, she continued performing. She released 4 albums. She held a Las Vegas residency that ran for 4 years and generated hundreds of millions of dollars. She appeared on television. She judged talent competitions. She worked constantly under a legal framework that classified her as unable to manage her own affairs. The contradiction was never publicly addressed. She was competent enough to perform, to generate revenue, to fulfill contracts, but not competent enough to control the money she earned or decide where she lived. Her father controlled everything: who she saw, where she went, what medications she took. She couldn't hire her own lawyer. She couldn't drive without permission. She couldn't make a cup of coffee in her own kitchen without it being monitored and logged. The conservatorship had become permanent infrastructure, not temporary intervention. She tried to end it multiple times, but the legal system that had created the conservatorship had no interest in dismantling it. The arrangement was profitable. Her father was paid, the lawyers were paid, the managers were paid. Everyone involved had a financial incentive to keep it in place. Her testimony, when she was finally allowed to give it in 2021, was disturbing in its specificity. She described being forced to perform, being prevented from removing an IUD, being medicated against her will. The real damage wasn't the loss of money, it was the loss of selfhood. The conservatorship finally ended in November 2021, after a public campaign and mounting legal pressure. But the years it had been in place couldn't be recovered. She had spent over a decade as a legal non-person, generating wealth she couldn't access, performing under coercion that was never named as such. The structure that was supposed to protect her had become the mechanism of her exploitation. What no one noticed then was that the system had been designed this way from the start. Not the conservatorship specifically, but the entire framework around her career. She had never been allowed to develop independently. She had been built, managed, and controlled since childhood. The conservatorship was just the formalization of what had always been true. She was free now, technically, but the infrastructure that had defined her life for 20 years was gone, and there was no blueprint for what came next. The money was still there. The fame was still there. But the person who had generated both had spent her entire adult life without autonomy, and autonomy, it turned out, was not something that could be simply granted back. Charlie Sheen. He grew up inside the machinery of Hollywood, not adjacent to it, inside it. His father was a movie star. The sets, the crews, the premieres, they were normal. By the time he was 9, he was already acting. By the time he was 20, he was a leading man. The transition from child to professional wasn't marked by struggle or breakthrough. It was seamless. Success didn't arrive suddenly. It accumulated. He starred in Platoon, Wall Street, Major League. He became one of the biggest stars of the 80s and 90s. The roles kept coming. The paychecks kept growing. And the lifestyle that came with it, the excess, the indulgence, the lack of consequences, became normalized. Not because he was uniquely reckless, but because Hollywood had always accommodated recklessness in people who were profitable. At the time, it didn't seem important. Charlie Sheen didn't lose control because he suddenly changed. He lost control because destructive behavior was never treated as destructive. It was reframed, excused, and eventually celebrated. For years, the drinking, the drugs, the arrests, the scandals, none of it stopped the work. He kept getting roles, he kept getting paid. The system around him absorbed the chaos and kept moving. In 2003, he was cast in 2.5 Men, a network sitcom that became one of the most watched shows on television. It wasn't prestige, it wasn't critical, but it was wildly profitable. At its peak, the show was generating hundreds of millions in revenue. Sheen was paid $1.8 million per episode, making him the highest paid actor on television. The work was consistent, the paycheck was enormous, and the structure around him required almost nothing except that he show up. He showed up, but everything else continued. The arrests accumulated. Domestic violence, drug possession, assault. Each incident was followed by a statement, a settlement, a brief pause, and then resumption. The show kept filming. The audience kept watching. The revenue kept flowing. There was no point at which the behavior triggered a structural consequence, because the behavior was profitable. The scandals generated headlines. The headlines generated attention. The attention generated ratings. Then, in 2011, he gave an interview. It wasn't planned as a meltdown. It was scheduled as damage control. But instead of apologizing or deflecting, he leaned in. He talked about winning. He claimed to have tiger blood and Adonis DNA. He called his bosses fools. He described his lifestyle, goddesses, drugs, parties, without shame or euphemism. The interview went viral, not because it was coherent, but because it was spectacular. The network fired him, not for the drugs, not for the arrests, for insulting the producer. His contract was terminated. The show continued without him. He sued for wrongful termination and eventually settled for $25 million. But the firing didn't end the spectacle, it amplified it. He launched a one-man tour called My Violent Torpedo of Truth, Defeat is Not an Option. It sold out immediately. Audiences paid to watch him rant on stage, incoherent and clearly unwell. Some shows were booed, others were cheered, but they all sold tickets. The collapse had become entertainment. The breakdown had become a brand. This was only the beginning. He starred in another sitcom, Anger Management, which ran for 100 episodes. The show was built around his public image, volatile, unpredictable, damaged. It wasn't good, but it didn't need to be. It needed to be watchable, and his presence made it watchable. The self-destruction that had ended his last show had now become the premise of the new one. But the money didn't stabilize things. It enabled them. He continued using. He was hospitalized multiple times. In 2015, he publicly disclosed that he was HIV positive and had known for years. The revelation came not as a health disclosure, but as tabloid damage control. He had been paying people to keep quiet, and the blackmail had become unsustainable. The announcement generated another wave of attention, another media cycle, another round of interviews where the spectacle was the point. The real damage came later. The work dried up, not immediately, but gradually. The novelty faded. The public moved on. The chaos that had made him interesting for a few years became exhausting to watch. Offers stopped coming. The money that had seemed infinite started running out. He owed millions in back taxes, child support, legal fees. The houses were sold, the lifestyle contracted. The people who had been around during the height of the spectacle were gone. What no one noticed then was that the entire collapse had been public, voluntary, and profitable, right up until it wasn't. He hadn't hidden his behavior. He had monetized it. The system had rewarded him for falling apart in public, and he had leaned into that reward. But the reward was temporary. The audience's appetite for chaos had limits, and once those limits were reached, there was nothing left except the damage that had been done while everyone was watching. He still gives occasional interviews. He still talks about the past. But the version of himself that became famous for self-destruction no longer has a market. The spectacle collapsed under its own weight, and what remained was someone who had turned his breakdown into content, profited from it briefly, and then discovered that the profit had always been the compensation for something irreversible. Kanye West. He had spent years trying to be taken seriously, not as a producer. He was already respected for that, but as an artist. He made beats for Jay-Z, for Ludacris, for Alicia Keys, but when he tried to rap, the industry resisted. He didn't fit the image. He wasn't hard enough, wasn't street enough. He wore polo shirts. He talked about his mother. He didn't perform the persona that rap was supposed to require. Then, The College Dropout came out in 2004, and everything changed. It wasn't just successful. It redefined what success could sound like. The album went triple platinum. It won a Grammy. It proved that vulnerability, introspection, and unorthodox production could sell. Kanye West wasn't just accepted, he was celebrated, and the validation didn't come quietly. It came as a wave, all at once, overwhelming. At the time, no one noticed what that level of affirmation would do. Kanye West didn't lose control because the fame corrupted him. He lost control because the fame validated everything, including the parts of himself that needed boundaries. The confidence that had pushed him to succeed, despite rejection, became untethered. The belief in his own vision, which had been correct about the music, started extending to everything else. And the industry, the media, the public, they rewarded it. Every outburst, every grandiose claim, every moment of excess was covered, discussed, and turned into content. He interrupted Taylor Swift at the VMAs in 2009, walked on stage, took the microphone, and declared that Beyoncé should have won. The moment was so shocking it became instant cultural currency. He was vilified, he was defended, he apologized, he disappeared for a while, but when he came back, the album he released, My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy, was immediately hailed as a masterpiece. The outburst hadn't damaged him, it had made him more compelling. The pattern was established. Disruption led to attention. Attention led to sales. Sales led to validation. And validation reinforced the belief that his instincts were always correct. The music kept coming. Each album was an event. But the behavior between albums started mattering more than the music itself. He announced he was running for president. He defended controversial figures. He appeared on podcasts and gave rambling, hours-long interviews that were incoherent but magnetic. He said slavery was a choice. He wore a MAGA hat. He changed his name to Ye. None of it stopped the attention. All of it generated more. His marriage to Kim Kardashian turned his personal life into a parallel spectacle. Their relationship was documented on television, in tabloids, on social media. Every moment was public. Every fight, every reconciliation, every decision about their children, it was all content, and content was currency. The more chaotic his behavior became, the more people watched. Then, the mental health component became undeniable. He had spoken about bipolar disorder publicly. He described manic episodes. He talked about refusing medication because it dulled his creativity. The admission was brave in a way, but it also became part of the brand. The mania wasn't treated as something that needed management. It was treated as the source of his genius. Interviews described him as unfiltered, as visionary, as someone who saw things others couldn't. The framing was romantic. The reality was someone cycling through episodes without consistent treatment, making decisions with enormous consequences while receiving affirmation instead of intervention. In 2022, everything accelerated. He made anti-Semitic comments, not vague implications, explicit statements. He praised Hitler. He appeared on podcasts and doubled down. The comments weren't buried or walked back. They were repeated, defended, amplified. For years, controversial statements had been absorbed by the system around him. This time, they weren't. Adidas ended their partnership with him, a deal worth billions. Balenciaga cut ties. Agencies dropped him. Brands distanced themselves. The financial infrastructure that had sustained his empire collapsed within weeks. But even then, the collapse was treated as content. He gave more interviews. He posted on social media. He framed the fallout as persecution, as proof that he was telling truths others were afraid to speak. Some people believed him. Enough people believed him that he retained an audience, a platform, a base. The attention didn't stop, it changed form. The real damage came later. The deals that had been lost weren't coming back. The companies that had partnered with him weren't going to reverse course. The financial losses weren't temporary setbacks. They were permanent. He had built an empire on partnerships, licensing, collaborations. Without those, the infrastructure collapsed. The wealth remained for now, but the machinery that had been generating more wealth had stopped. What no one noticed then was that the system had never imposed limits. Every escalation had been met with more attention, more coverage, more engagement. The mania had been framed as genius. The outbursts had been framed as authenticity, and the validation had kept coming, right up until the moment it didn't. But by then, the behavior had become so entrenched, so reinforced by years of reward, that there was no mechanism left to contain it. He still releases music. He still has an audience. But the cultural power he once held, the ability to shift entire industries, to dictate trends, to command attention without effort, is gone. The platform remains, but the authority has eroded. And the collapse wasn't caused by a lack of talent. It was caused by a system that turned loss of control into validation, and validation into identity, until the two became inseparable. Johnny Depp. He had spent the 90s being selective, not because he needed to be. He could have taken any role offered, but because he wanted to mean something. He worked with Tim Burton. He played odd, offbeat characters in films that were critically respected but not always commercial. Edward Scissorhands, Ed Wood, Donnie Brasco. He was taken seriously. He was admired. He was careful. Then Pirates of the Caribbean came out in 2003, and carefulness stopped being necessary. The film was supposed to be a risk. Disney was nervous. Pirates movies didn't work anymore. The character Depp created, slurring, swaying, ambiguously intoxicated, was strange enough that executives considered firing him mid-production, but audiences loved it. The movie made over $600 million. He was nominated for an Academy Award, and suddenly, Johnny Depp wasn't just a serious actor. He was a franchise. At the time, it didn't seem important. Johnny Depp didn't lose control because he made a single bad decision. He lost control because success removed every reason to restrain himself. The money was enormous. The sequels kept coming, and the lifestyle that had been funded modestly before became funded excessively. He bought islands. He bought estates in France. He collected art, wine, guitars. He spent $2 million a month, a figure so large it became shorthand for excess, even among people who understood wealth. The spending wasn't celebratory, it was atmospheric. He bought a village in France. He bought a yacht. He amassed a wine collection worth hundreds of thousands of dollars annually. He paid staff, security, assistants, managers, 40 people on permanent payroll. The purchases weren't impulsive in the traditional sense. They were considered, planned, executed. But they were also unsustainable, and no one told him they were unsustainable because the money kept coming in. The Pirates films alone earned him over $300 million. He was one of the highest paid actors in the world. And the assumption, shared by everyone around him, was that the money was infinite. So the spending continued. The lifestyle expanded, and the line between what he earned and what he spent dissolved entirely. Then the films stopped working. The later Pirates sequels made money, but less each time. The critical reception soured. Other projects, expensive, ambitious, failed to connect. Dark Shadows, Transcendence, Mordecai, each one lost money. His reputation as a reliable box office draw started to crack. The fees remained high, but the offers became less frequent. The machinery that had sustained his spending was slowing down, but the spending wasn't. In 2016, his financial managers sued him, claiming gross financial mismanagement. He countersued. The lawsuits revealed details that should have remained private. The $2 million a month, the private island, the staff, the wine. The discovery process made public what had been quietly assumed, that his finances were structured for revenue that no longer matched reality. But the financial collapse was only part of it. His marriage to Amber Heard, which had begun in 2015, ended a year later in a public and increasingly vicious legal battle. She accused him of abuse. He denied it. The accusations were covered extensively. Then, his lawsuit against a British tabloid brought more details into public record. Text messages, testimonies, photos. The trial was streamed, dissected, turned into memes. His career stalled further. Studios distanced themselves. Warner Brothers asked him to resign from the Fantastic Beasts franchise. Disney dropped him from future Pirates films. This was only the beginning. The defamation trial against Heard in 2022 became a cultural event. Millions watched daily. Social media picked sides. The trial revealed years of mutual toxicity, substance abuse, and dysfunction. He won the case. The verdict was celebrated by his supporters as vindication. But the cost of winning was enormous, not just financially but reputationally. The details that emerged during the trial painted a picture of someone whose personal life had deteriorated completely. Regardless of the legal outcome, the real damage came later. He had won the trial, but the work didn't come back. The studios that had distanced themselves didn't reverse course. The verdict didn't translate into restored partnerships. His financial situation remained precarious. The estates were still expensive to maintain. The staff was still on payroll. The spending structure hadn't changed, but the revenue had. What no one noticed then was that the collapse hadn't been sudden. It had been gradual, accumulating across years of unchecked spending and professional decline. The success had insulated him from consequences for so long that by the time consequences arrived, they arrived all at once. The money, the career, the reputation, all of it had seemed secure because it had been secure for decades. But security built on continuous revenue collapses the moment the revenue stops, and nothing about his lifestyle had been designed to survive interruption. He still acts. He still has supporters. But the career that once defined him is diminished. The wealth that once seemed infinite is constrained. And the version of himself that existed at the height of his fame, the careful, selective actor who meant something, was replaced years ago by someone whose excess became the story, and whose attempts to reclaim control only made the loss of it more visible. Allen Iverson. He came from nothing, not the metaphorical kind, the actual kind. Hampton, Virginia, poverty, instability. His mother was 17 when he was born. His father was gone. By the time he was a teenager, he was the best basketball player anyone in the area had ever seen. It wasn't just talent, it was ferocity. He played like survival depended on it, because for most of his life, it had. Then, he was drafted first overall by the Philadelphia 76ers in 1996, and survival was no longer the question. The contract was worth $9 million over 3 years. For someone who had grown up with nothing, $9 million might as well have been infinite. The money was real. The career was real. But nothing about his upbringing had prepared him to manage either. He had been taught to survive, not to plan. And the NBA, for all its infrastructure, didn't teach financial literacy. It paid him. What he did with the money was his problem. At the time, no one noticed what that would mean. Allen Iverson didn't lose control because he was careless. He lost control because he was surrounded by people who had been waiting their entire lives for him to make it, and making it meant taking care of everyone. His mother, his friends, his extended family, the neighborhood he came from. The structure wasn't exploitative in the traditional sense, it was relational. But the effect was the same. The money didn't accumulate, it dispersed. He bought houses, multiple houses for multiple people. He bought cars, he bought jewelry, not occasionally, but constantly. Chains, watches, bracelets. The jewelry wasn't just decorative, it was symbolic. It was proof that he had made it, that he wasn't struggling anymore, that the fear of losing everything was gone. But the fear never actually left. It just changed shape. He had an entourage, 50 people, sometimes more, traveling with him, staying in his hotels, eating at his restaurants. He paid for all of it, not because he was forced to, but because loyalty mattered. These were the people who had been there before the money. Turning them away would have felt like betrayal. So they stayed. And the money that should have been building security was instead funding a rolling community that depended entirely on his continued earning. The career itself was extraordinary. He was Rookie of the Year. He was MVP in 2001. He led the 76ers to the NBA Finals. He was one of the most electrifying players in the league. Small, fast, fearless. But the career was also short. Basketball careers always are. The body breaks down, the knees, the ankles, the back. By his early 30s, he was already declining. The explosiveness was gone. The teams that had once fought to sign him were now hesitant. He kept playing, but the contracts got smaller. He went to Denver, to Detroit, to Memphis. Each stop was shorter than the last. By 2010, his NBA career was over. He tried playing overseas, Turkey, Puerto Rico, but those stints didn't last either. The revenue stream that had funded everything for over a decade had stopped, and the structure built on that revenue didn't have a backup plan. Then the money ran out. Not slowly, suddenly. In 2012, a judge ordered him to pay over $800,000 to a jeweler for unpaid debts. The case revealed that he had been borrowing against future earnings for years, and those earnings had stopped coming. He owed back taxes. He owed child support. He owed money to creditors who had extended credit based on the assumption that he would always be Allen Iverson, and Allen Iverson would always have money. He didn't. The houses were gone. The jewelry had been sold or seized. The entourage had dissolved the moment the money stopped. He filed for bankruptcy in 2012, listing debts that far exceeded his assets. At the peak, he had earned over $200 million. A decade later, it was gone. But there was a clause. Reebok, his longtime sponsor, had structured his endorsement deal with a trust that he couldn't access until he turned 55. $32 million, protected from creditors, from lawsuits, from his own spending. It was the only thing that survived. Not because he had planned it, but because Reebok had insisted on it. The structure that saved him wasn't one he had built. It was one that had been built around him, by people who understood that without protection, the money wouldn't last. The real damage wasn't the loss of the money. It was the realization that the money had never been his to begin with, not in the sense that it had been taken, but in the sense that it had always been flowing through him, not to him. He had been the conduit, not the destination. And once the flow stopped, there was nothing left to hold. What no one noticed then was that the system had never equipped him to succeed off the court. It had given him money, fame, opportunity, but no framework to manage any of it. The people around him had depended on him, but none of them had protected him. And by the time he realized that protection was necessary, there was nothing left to protect. He survived. The Reebok trust ensured that. But the life he had imagined, the security, the stability, the proof that he had made it, never materialized. The money came, and the money went, and what remained was the knowledge that extraordinary talent and extraordinary earnings had not been enough. Lindsay Lohan. She was famous before she had a self to be famous with. Not metaphorically, literally. She was a child actor, working before she could understand what working meant. The Parent Trap was released when she was 11. She was charming, talented, natural on screen. The film was a success. More roles followed. Freaky Friday, Mean Girls. By the time she was 18, she was one of the most recognizable young women in the world. But the person everyone recognized had never been allowed to develop in private. Lindsay Lohan didn't lose control because fame arrived too soon. She lost control because fame replaced the developmental space where a self is supposed to form. Adolescence is chaotic for everyone, But most people experience that chaos privately. Their mistakes are witnessed by a few people, forgotten and learned from. Her mistakes were photographed, published, archived, and monetized. Every misstep became content. Every private moment became public record. At the time, no one noticed what that was doing. She turned 18 in 2004, the same year Mean Girls was released. The film made her a star in a new way, not as a child actor, but as a cultural figure. She was invited to parties. She was photographed constantly. She was dating, drinking, experimenting. All of it was normal for 18. None of it was private. The paparazzi followed her everywhere. Not occasionally, every day, every night. They waited outside her apartment. They followed her car. They photographed her at clubs, at restaurants, getting gas, leaving the gym. They created a market for images of her, and the more chaotic her behavior, the more valuable the images became. The coverage wasn't neutral observation. It was incentivized chaos. The worse things got, the more the photos sold. She started missing work, showing up late to sets, calling in sick. Her behavior on the set of Georgia Rule in 2006 was so erratic that the studio sent her a public letter calling it unprofessional. The letter was leaked. It became another story. The work that had once been the foundation of her identity was now just another site of visible collapse. Then the arrests started. DUI in 2007, another DUI 3 weeks later, cocaine possession. The arrests weren't private. They were photographed, reported, turned into headlines. She went to rehab. She left rehab. She went back. The cycle became the narrative. The media stopped covering her career and started covering her dysfunction. And the dysfunction, because it was so visible, became the career. She kept working, but the roles changed. She wasn't being cast as a lead anymore. She was being cast as someone whose presence generated attention regardless of the quality of the project. The work wasn't about performance. It was about spectacle. She appeared in tabloids more often than on screen. Her name was more associated with mugshots than movies. In 2010, she was sentenced to jail for violating probation. She served 2 weeks. She was released, arrested again, sent to rehab again. The court mandated therapy, sobriety monitoring, community service. Every aspect of her life was now supervised, medicalized, or litigated. The independence that should have come with adulthood never arrived. Instead, her life became a series of interventions, each one more public than the last. This was only the beginning. The money was gone. Not all at once, but steadily. She had earned millions as a teenager, but the earnings had stopped while the expenses continued. Legal fees, rehab bills, settlements. She owed back taxes. She was sued by former employees, by production companies, by landlords. The financial collapse mirrored the personal one. Both were public, both were chaotic, and both felt inevitable to everyone watching except her. She moved to Los Angeles, then New York, then London, then Dubai. Each move was framed as a fresh start. Each fresh start lasted a few months before collapsing. The problem wasn't the location. The problem was that there was no stable self underneath the movement. Fame had arrived before identity had formed, and identity, it turned out, wasn't something that could be developed retroactively in public. The real damage came later. She tried to return to acting. She appeared in smaller projects, independent films, a short-lived reality show. But the audience that had grown up with her no longer trusted her as a performer. They saw her as a tabloid figure, someone whose personal chaos overshadowed any professional credibility. The roles she was offered reflected that. She wasn't being cast as a serious actor. She was being cast as herself, or rather, as the public's idea of herself. What no one noticed then was that the collapse had been structural from the beginning. She had been famous before she had the capacity to consent to fame. The decisions that shaped her adolescence had been made by other people, managers, parents, studios, and by the time she was old enough to make her own decisions, the infrastructure around her had already collapsed, and she had no experience making decisions without that infrastructure. She survived. She moved to Dubai, stayed out of the tabloids, lived more quietly, but the life she might have had, the career, the stability, the privacy, was gone. Not because she destroyed it, but because it had never been allowed to exist in the first place. The fame had arrived too early. The scrutiny had been too constant, and the person underneath it all had never been given the space to become someone who could handle either. If this kind of story keeps you listening, there's a lot more coming. Subscribing is the easiest way to stay with it. Conor McGregor. He came from Crumlin, a working-class neighborhood in Dublin. He was a plumber's apprentice, collecting welfare checks while training in mixed martial arts in a gym that was barely heated. He had been fighting for years in small promotions, making almost nothing, convinced that he was destined for something larger. Most fighters never make it out of those small shows. Most train for years and never get the call. McGregor got the call in 2013. The UFC signed him. His first fight in the organization he won in the first round. His second fight he won in the first round. His third, fourth, fifth, all finishes, all spectacular. He wasn't just winning, he was dominating, and more importantly, he was talking. Before the fights, after the fights, during press conferences, he predicted outcomes, insulted opponents, created storylines. The fighting was exceptional. The spectacle was better. By 2015, he was a champion. By 2016, he was the biggest star in the sport. At the time, it didn't seem important. Conor McGregor didn't lose control because he couldn't fight anymore. He lost control because the validation from fighting became untethered from the discipline fighting required. The fame, the money, the attention, it all arrived because he was the best. But once it arrived, being the best stopped being necessary. The spectacle sustained itself. He could sell pay-per-views by talking. He could generate headlines by showing up. The fight itself became optional. He fought Floyd Mayweather in 2017, a boxing match that made him over $100 million. He lost, but it didn't matter. The money was bigger than the loss. The event was bigger than the result. He had crossed over from fighter to celebrity, and celebrity didn't require winning. It required presence. The money changed everything. He bought mansions. He bought cars. He launched a whiskey brand that sold for hundreds of millions. He wore custom suits, expensive watches. He posted photos of himself on yachts, in private jets, surrounded by luxury. The image wasn't incidental. It was the product. The fighting had made him famous. The fame made him rich. The wealth made him untouchable. Or it seemed that way. He stopped fighting regularly. The gaps between fights grew longer. When he did fight, he lost. Khabib Nurmagomedov submitted him in 2018. Dustin Poirier knocked him out in 2021, then broke his leg in the rematch. The dominance that had built his career was gone, but the persona remained. The trash talk, the bravado, the promises of comebacks. The spectacle continued even as the substance disappeared. Then the behavior outside the ring became the story. He was arrested in Miami in 2019 for smashing a fan's phone. He was accused of sexual assault in Dublin in 2019. Another accusation followed in 2020. The cases were settled or dropped, but the pattern was visible. The aggression that had been celebrated in the octagon was now spilling into every other part of his life. The discipline that fighting requires, the training, the focus, the restraint, had evaporated. What remained was the entitlement that success had created, without the structure that had once contained it. He punched an old man in a pub in Dublin in 2019. The footage was leaked. The man had refused a shot of McGregor's whiskey, and McGregor hit him. The assault was casual, unprovoked. It wasn't rage, it was reflex. The assumption that he could do whatever he wanted had become so embedded that consequences no longer registered as possible. In 2021, he broke his leg during a fight with Poirier. The injury was severe. The recovery took over a year. He posted videos of himself training, promising to return, but the return kept getting delayed. The fighting, which had once been the center of his identity, was now something he talked about more than he did. The wealth had made fighting optional, and once it was optional, it stopped being central. This was only the beginning. The accusations continued. Another woman came forward in 2024, alleging sexual assault. The case went to civil court. McGregor denied everything. The jury found him liable. The judgment was significant, but it wasn't the financial cost that mattered. It was the public perception. The image he had built, brash, confident, unstoppable, was now associated with violence outside the context that had justified it. The real damage came later. The UFC stripped him of his promotional role. Sponsors distanced themselves. The whiskey brand, once a symbol of his business acumen, became harder to market. His social media posts, which had once generated excitement, now generated scrutiny. Everything he said was examined for evidence of instability. Everything he did was framed as further decline. What no one noticed then was that the validation had escalated faster than the accountability. The system that had celebrated him for years had never imposed limits. The trash talk had been rewarded. The bravado had been profitable. The aggression had been monetized. And by the time the behavior crossed into territory that couldn't be excused, the patterns were too entrenched to change. He still trains. He still posts. He still talks about returning to fighting. But the career that made him is over, and the life he built on that career is unraveling. The money is still there, but the respect is gone. The fame remains, but it's no longer admiration. It's attention without affection. And the version of himself that the world celebrated, the fighter who talked like a champion and fought like one, has been replaced by someone whose identity is defined entirely by excess and the consequences that come with it. Nicolas Cage. He grew up as part of Hollywood royalty. His uncle was Francis Ford Coppola. His family was embedded in the industry. But he didn't want to be seen as someone who had been handed a career. He changed his name from Coppola to Cage, deliberately distancing himself from the association. He wanted to be taken seriously on his own terms, and for years he was. He won an Academy Award in 1996 for Leaving Las Vegas. He starred in some of the biggest films of the 90s and early 2000s: The Rock, Face Off, Con Air, National Treasure. He was bankable, talented, eclectic. He could do action, drama, comedy. He was one of the most successful actors of his generation. The money was enormous, and the spending matched it. At the time, it didn't seem important. Nicolas Cage didn't lose control because he couldn't act anymore. He lost control because the wealth gave him the ability to indulge every impulse without consequence, and by the time consequences arrived, the spending was so deep and so structural that stopping it wasn't possible. He bought castles, multiple castles, one in Germany, two in England. He bought a private island in the Bahamas. He bought 15 mansions, including a waterfront estate in Newport Beach and a compound in Las Vegas. He didn't just buy houses. He bought estates, properties that required staff, maintenance, taxes. Each one was another fixed cost, another permanent drain. He collected cars, Rolls-Royces, Lamborghinis, Ferraris, dozens of them. He collected comic books, spent millions building one of the most valuable collections in the world. He bought a dinosaur skull. He bought rare animals. He bought shrunken heads, haunted houses, private jets. The purchases weren't impulsive in the way that suggests recklessness. They were deliberate, considered, obsessive, but they were also unsustainable. The spending wasn't funded by savings. It was funded by continuous work, and the work, for a while, was continuous. He made multiple films a year. The paychecks were large. The assumption was that they would keep coming, but the film industry is cyclical. Tastes change. Careers plateau. And by the mid-2000s, the films he was making were no longer the cultural events they had been. Some of them went straight to video. The fees remained high, but the volume of the high-paying work started to decline. He kept spending. In 2007, at the peak of his real estate accumulation, he owned 15 properties simultaneously. The carrying costs alone, mortgages, taxes, insurance, staff, were in the millions annually. But the revenue was no longer matching the expenses. The gap should have been obvious. It wasn't, or it was ignored, or the belief that the money would keep coming was strong enough to override the math. Then, the financial crisis hit in 2008. Property values collapsed. The homes he had bought at peak prices were now worth far less, but the debts attached to them hadn't changed. He owed more than the properties were worth. Selling them wouldn't solve the problem. It would crystallize the loss. He didn't sell them, not at first. He kept trying to maintain the lifestyle, the collection, the properties, but the revenue wasn't there anymore. The high-paying roles had dried up. The films he was making were low budget, often forgettable. He was still working constantly, but the work was no longer covering the costs. In 2009, the IRS filed a federal tax lien against him for over $6 million in unpaid taxes. The number kept growing. By the time the full extent of his financial collapse became public, he owed over $14 million in back taxes alone. That didn't include the mortgages, the debts to creditors, the lawsuits from former business managers. He started selling the castles, the island, the mansions, the cars, the comic book collection, including a rare Action Comics #1 that sold for over $2 million. The sales weren't voluntary. They were necessary. And even after selling almost everything, the debt remained. The real damage came later. He kept acting, but the roles were different now. He wasn't choosing projects. He was taking whatever paid. Straight-to-video action films, low-budget thrillers, films that premiered on streaming services no one had heard of. He made multiple films a year, sometimes 5 or 6, often more. The work was relentless, but it wasn't the career he had built. It was the career he was forced into by the debt he couldn't escape. The public perception shifted. He became a punchline, the guy who would appear in anything, the actor who had somehow squandered one of the most successful careers in Hollywood. The memes were constant. Every bad movie, every bizarre role, every straight-to-video release was treated as further evidence of collapse. But he kept working, not because he wanted to, because he had to. The debt required it. The IRS required it. The lifestyle he had built, even in its dramatically reduced form, required it. The spending had created obligations that outlasted the income, and the only way to meet those obligations was to keep earning, regardless of what the work was or what it cost him professionally. What no one noticed then was that the collapse had been structural from the beginning. The wealth hadn't been managed, it had been spent. The purchases hadn't been investments, they had been expenses. And once the revenue slowed, the expenses didn't stop. They compounded. The castles, the cars, the collections. They had all required continuous income to sustain, and when that income disappeared, the structure collapsed entirely. He's still acting, he's still making films, but the career that once represented artistic ambition and commercial success is now defined entirely by financial necessity. The money he makes goes to debts, taxes, and obligations that were created decades ago, and the version of himself that won an Academy Award, that starred in blockbusters, that was taken seriously as an actor. That version is gone, replaced by someone whose only choice is to keep working, because stopping would mean losing whatever remained. Bam Margera, he was famous for hurting himself, not metaphorically, literally. Jackass, the MTV show that made him a star, was built around stunts, pranks, and physical damage performed for entertainment. He was 21 when the show debuted in 2000. It became a cultural phenomenon. The cast were celebrities. The stunts were imitated. The show led to movies, tours, sponsorships. Bam Margera's entire public identity was built during those years, and it never evolved past them. At the time, it didn't seem important. Bam Margera didn't lose control because fame corrupted him. He lost control because fame froze him. The person he was at 21, chaotic, impulsive, funny in a way that required no restraint, became the person he was expected to remain. And the system around him, the audience, the industry, all of it rewarded him for staying exactly that way. Growth wasn't required. Maturity wasn't required. The show, the films, the stunts, they all required him to keep performing a version of himself that had no room for development. He was rich. The Jackass films made hundreds of millions of dollars. He had his own MTV show, Viva La Bam, which ran for 5 seasons. He was touring, skateboarding, appearing at events. The lifestyle was excessive, but it was also the brand. The drinking, the chaos, the destruction, It wasn't separate from the work. It was the work. His best friend, Ryan Dunn, died in a car crash in 2011. Dunn had been drinking. He drove his Porsche off the road at over 100 miles an hour and hit a tree. He and his passenger were killed instantly. The accident was horrific, but it was also preventable. And for Margera, it was the first thing that couldn't be turned into content. The death broke something. He started drinking more, using more. The chaos that had been performed for cameras was now just chaos. There was no structure around it, no production schedule, no crew. The behaviors that had been monetized for years were now just destructive, and there was no mechanism to stop them. He went to rehab multiple times. He left. He went back. He posted videos from rehab, sometimes while still in rehab, violating the rules and getting kicked out. The cycle was public. His family intervened. His friends intervened. Doctors, therapists, legal guardians, everyone tried. Nothing stuck. In 2021, he was fired from the new Jackass film. The production had tried to accommodate him. They included clauses in his contract requiring sobriety, regular drug tests, therapy. He violated all of them. He showed up intoxicated. He refused to comply with the testing. He was let go before filming finished. He responded by posting angry videos online, threatening legal action, accusing his friends of betrayal. The lawsuit he filed argued that he had been exploited, that his struggles were being used for profit without his consent. But the argument collapsed under its own weight. The entire premise of his career had been self-exploitation. The stunts, the injuries, the chaos, it had all been voluntary, performed for money and attention. The contract he had signed for the new film was an attempt to protect him, not exploit him. But by then, the distinction didn't register. Everything felt like betrayal. This was only the beginning. He kept posting videos of himself drunk, ranting, incoherent, photos from bars, from hotels, from wherever he was staying that week. The posts weren't strategic. They weren't content. They were just visibility. The compulsion to be seen, which had sustained his career, was now the only thing left. But the audience wasn't entertained anymore. They were watching someone collapse in real time, and the collapse had long since stopped being interesting. His family placed him under a temporary conservatorship in 2021, similar to what had happened with Britney Spears. The legal arrangement gave his mother control over his medical and financial decisions. It was supposed to be protective, but for Margera, it felt like the final loss of control. He fled. He posted videos from undisclosed locations, claiming he was being held against his will, that everyone was conspiring against him. The real damage came later. The money was gone, not from a single catastrophic loss, but from years of unmanaged spending, legal fees, rehab bills, and settlements. The career that had made him rich had ended years ago. The residuals from Jackass weren't enough to sustain the lifestyle he had maintained during its peak. The sponsorships had dried up. The appearances were rare. He was still famous, but fame without work is just recognition, and recognition doesn't pay bills. What no one noticed then was that the person he had become at 21 had never been allowed to age. The identity that made him famous, reckless, fearless, willing to destroy himself for a laugh, was sustainable only with youth, health, and a system that turned destruction into profit. Once any of those disappeared, the identity didn't adapt. It collapsed. He's still alive, still posting, still cycling through interventions and relapses. But the person the public remembers, the skateboarder, the prankster, the star of Jackass, is gone. What remains is someone trapped in the performance of a life that ended 20 years ago, unable to move forward, because the only version of himself anyone valued was the one that never grew up.